My name is Joe Gibbs. I'm the Canon for Christian Education at the Cathedral Church of the Advent in Birmingham, Alabama. And I'm here with my friend Dr. Mark Gentilette, who is the Associate Professor of Divinity at Beeson Divinity School, also in Birmingham. And we are talking about Christian education, and specifically today about teaching and the teaching ministry here for Sunday school. And so the question really that we want to talk about today is how do you get from the beginning of an idea about a class to the end of a class? I mean, how do you take a thought and say, I want to teach about that, and then what is the process getting to the class? And so maybe as we start, do you have something, just an overall sort of thought about Sunday school as teaching as opposed to maybe a pulpit ministry?
Yeah. Part of this is related, I think, to my own story and coming to terms with my own vocational identity and the life of the church. My role here at Advent has been a blessing. I first came to Beeson a decade ago. I knew that I was coming right out of postgraduate study in this sort of cerebral world of higher academic study. And then I come back into a seminary context with an emphasis on local church preparation. And I realized that there's a real disjunct between sort of highbrow academic life and then moving into local churches and speaking and preparing men and women who are going into the local church to do that kind of work. So I remember asking one of my colleagues, I'd like to do some teaching here or there, and they said, well, why don't you just go out and do it? And I didn't know how to pull that off, so I began to make it a matter of prayer. And I realized as teaching opportunities began to arise in Birmingham that it actually wasn't all that natural to make that move from an academic context into a local church context, but it was integral and important and vital to think critically through how to do that. So I had to give a lot of thought to that on the front end about how different social context for teaching shapes the way in which you actually go about doing that teaching. Now, for our people here at Advent, I imagine when it comes to theology teaching and Bible teaching, this is their primary context. So I'm spinning a couple of different plates in that regard. But my sense is, and I think about this when I look out at my students at Beeson Divinity School, my sense is that line between preacher and teacher exists, but it probably should be fuzzy where it does. So you think about the movement is in Ephesians where Paul says God gives to his church preachers and teachers. And so there's different gifts, and people I think have different strengths in different areas. But preaching emphasizes, I think, the exhortative side of the communicative moment. There's an exhortation that's going on, where I think teaching has an exhortative side as well, but maybe there's not as much emphasis on that. So there's not as much of maybe a reticence to give content within teaching. For example, I heard you preach yesterday, right? And when you were in the pulpit yesterday, you weren't really telling everybody that was sitting out there all the hard work you did out in the exegetical tool shed. But I imagine a lot of work was going on, and you left your tools and the sawdust there, and then you gave us the final. Whereas I think in the teaching context, you're allowed to bring some of the sawdust and some of the tools in. So this is a difference there. But I think the line is a soft one.
I would actually say that I've had a more difficulty than I imagined going from pulpit to teaching. I think that it's I have, as you say, the transition from academic world to teaching in a local church context. The transition for me from pulpit to the teaching has been it's not an easy transition either. So
that's interesting to hear that. I've had to wrestle with that myself. I don't do as much preaching as I do teaching. And I don't know if you feel this way or not. I don't feel like preaching, at least to my own mind, is like learning to ride a bike. I think once you learn to ride a bike, you know how to do it. I feel like preaching, every time I do it, I have to work hard at it.
Right.
And I've become less comfortable with that as I've increased in my comfort with teaching. And it's probably just because I do more of the former than the latter. But to see, you raised the question, why is this important? I think it's extremely important because the pulpit, with its emphasis on exhortation, bringing the scriptures to bear on people's lives, leaving them with the word of gospel hope, with their eyes fixed on Jesus as they leave. We gather then to scatter in our communities. That can only do so much, really, when it comes to passing on I guess the technical term is the catechetical necessities within the life of the church. People need to be taught, and so I have a high valuation for the continued teaching office in the life of the church and men and women who are called to do that. So I guess I would consider, say for example, in the context of Advent, I would consider the teaching ministry here under the larger umbrella, I guess, of Christian catechesis. We're teaching people the basics of biblical content and the biblical story and biblical theology as that relates to the way in which we think, as that relates to the way in which we feel and the way in which we go about our lives. So I think that seems, at least to my own mind, that seems to be at the core of why the teaching ministry exists.
I think I learned to teach, sometimes listening to preachers in other denominations. Those are longer 45-minute, 3 or 4 points, and whereas we just have usually 12, 14 minutes in the pulpit. So
so you have to streamline that. You have to get it down to. I mean, for example, if you listen to some of these, I guess Tim Keller is getting a lot of airtime these days on some of these. If you listen to a Keller sermon, as I've started to recently, I get the sense, just listening to it analytically, that the line there between preaching and teaching is very fuzzy.
Right.
Very fuzzy.
Yeah, sure.
I get what you're saying.
Well, how do you pick a topic? I mean, do you start with a thought and move to a scripture, or you're reading your Bible and think, I really want to teach this, and kind of take out of that some topics? How do you start?
I don't think I really have a formula that I'm working with. I'm sure this is kind of a very subjective thing. I guess people would give different answers to this. I will say I heard I asked someone who I respect in the sort of field about their publishing life. Tell me about how you produce so much, and the answer that he gave to me was, that's really good advice. I always try to publish something 3 times. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I'll do something in an academic venue, but then if I've done the research on something, I'll try to do it in a popular venue, maybe in a homiletical venue as well. So I try to make good use of the research that I'm doing.
I see.
So and I don't know if you feel this way, my sense is the best teaching takes place when 2 things are going on. Number 1, the teacher has been giving thought for a while to that subject. And number 2, the teacher's excited about it. If the notebook for the class opens up and you have to, sort of blow the dust off of it, nestle in for a rough half hour. But I think if your teaching life, which really isn't the luxury you have, I guess, in a lectionary context, preaching, right? Because you're assigned what you're giving there.
Right.
I mean, in a teaching context, I would say most of my teaching here at Advent, unless I'm asked to do something targeted, and that happens every once in a while, flows from the current research interest that I have at the time, something I'm writing on or thinking about, or maybe even teaching at Beeson, and trying to take something that's in an academic context at Beeson and moving it to a more practical context here. So that tends to be. Now, I will say, I've tried to work here on a sort of, not tri-semester, but I guess a tri-semester thought of, I like to do something Old Testament, I like to do something New Testament, and then I like to do something that's bona fide sort of Christian theology. So I try to work in that, but I'm not tied to that necessarily.
Sure. So Mark, let's just say, like, if you're coming to a text, and you're going to teach on a particular text of the Bible, what questions do you ask of the text? How do you come to the text and to begin your preparation?
Yeah. I guess the basic questions that I'm asking of the biblical text when I'm engaging it is very simply, what does it say and why does it matter? Those are the 2 rudimentary questions that I think are tips of icebergs that have an enormous amount of substance underneath the surface. So I try to ask that kind of question. When I think about it from the standpoint of the Bible and how we interpret the Bible, I live with 2 realities, and that is God in His providence has given us His Word through the medium of human language, where there's words there, and there's words that come together with other words to make meaning. So I've got to wrestle with, on some level, with what we might call, the technical term would be the semantic level of the text, but just what the words mean and what they're doing. But I never divorce the words of the text themselves from the Bible's ultimate subject matter. So the words and the subject matter are fitted together in an insoluble relationship that can't really be pulled apart. I do think there are some within, say, biblical scholarship who will view it just as the words, right, in a historical context, and then that's enough. But we have to wrestle with, I think, as Christian readers of the Bible, what's the Bible's subject matter? What's it about? And the answer to that is it's God's revelation of Himself in Jesus by the Spirit. It's a Trinitarian frame for reading. So when I'm reading a biblical text and trying to come to terms with it, I want the questions that I bring to the text to be questions that are formed by a Christian theological view on the world and on life and on reality, as I wrestle with what these words mean here in this particular context. So that's the world I think that I'm living in. And then what's nice about a context like Advent, unlike I think really maybe a more academic context where I teach, is I'm pressured more to think about, and now how do I relate this to the 65-year-old single woman who's going to be in my class, and I know she'll be there Sunday, or the young married couple, and they're thinking about these issues. And so I try not to work too hard to force the text into those situations, but I'm aware that those people are there and that they're there to hear a word. So I think I try to think in that way as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions I want to get to is how do you consider the audience? When I asked a Lenten preacher one time, I said, "How do you get from the text to the pulpit?" And he said, "My first step is to know how the text speaks to me."
Yeah.
And so, what before we ask the about the audience, what about you? I mean, what questions do you ask of yourself, or what personal engagement do you have with the text before you begin to bring it out into a teaching?
I mean, just to be honest with you, I struggle with that question to this day. I mean, that's a question about my own personal piety and the relationship between study and prayer and the intellectual life, which I think modernity is probably, and I don't want to speak too fastly here, was probably really problematized for us, this divorcing of the mind from the heart or the affections from the intellect. I'm not sure I've got that all sorted out in my own sort of personal story, but I think that question's an important one.
Yeah.
I think it's crucial. So when I think about the tradition, say like St. Augustine, as received by Thomas Cranmer, if we asked those two gentlemen, they were here, tell us what do you think is the most important attribute of a reader of the Bible, I think we'd be stunned to hear what they said. They wouldn't say initially, that you've got your MDiv and that you can exegete this and the other. And I don't think they downplay any of that. I think they would lead with, to be a good reader of the Bible, is to be someone who loves the text and loves the one who wrote it and is willing to do what it says. It's humility, right? And where we tend to think of it as, and I'm bringing all my interpretive prowess to try to make this text do it. No, I think they would say the proper approach to this from a personal standpoint is a going low. And that weighs on me. I mean, I live with that, that's a constant reality of dying and being born again.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I know for me, sometimes I do a better job of remembering to ask that question, and sometimes sometimes you just have to. Sunday's coming. You just got to get your kids need to go.
Right. The tyranny of the clock.
That's
right.
But I think that's really good. Now, so how you mentioned a moment ago, you do consider what the audience and who might be in the class. In what ways do you do that?
Well, I said that, and let me nuance it a little bit. I do think about that, and I don't. Again, because there can be a view on application, I think, or of applying the Bible, which, at least to my own way of understanding this, in light of the Christian tradition, I don't see application as a tack-on to biblical exegesis or exposition. So, for example, if you're preparing a Sunday school class and you're wanting to work through whatever and think about what it means and why that's significant, that next move is not a tack-on. I think that is wed to the one project of reading the Bible in an expositional way. So I do try to give thought to that, but at the same time, I don't want application to be a kind of the tyranny of being relevant. In other words, like
Sure, yeah.
I've got to make this text matter to myself in aisle 7 of Publix tomorrow. Or this text has to help me improve my marriage tomorrow. That might happen, but I do think there is some wisdom in walking between two dangers, and that is, number one, not saying anything that moves into the life of the hearer, keeping a kind of safe objective distance. And then the other danger would be forcing the text in such a way that doesn't allow room for the Holy Spirit to do His work in people's lives as they hear what you're saying. You've had this experience preaching. I know I have it teaching as well. It's just stunning, actually, the way in which people receive things.
That's right.
And I like keeping space for that, but at the same time, I don't want that to be my get out of jail free card for relinquishing the responsibility of thinking about this text for them. So that's kind of the way in which I sort of try to think through that.
Sure. Well, let me ask you this: sort of go down that road. What role does prayer play for you in your preparation, and then what role does the Spirit play in your actual presentation? In other words, like, you're sticking closely to the text or that you have written down, or do you feel some freedom to move away from that or in and out of it?
Yeah.
So start with prayer and then kind of move into
two
the
good
Spirit.
questions there. Yeah. Again, prayer. Gosh, it's just an area of joyful burden. I think I still feel like I'm just out of the gate, negotiating that area of my own spiritual life. But I do believe very firmly that prayer, or maybe even expanding what we might think of as prayer, as a conscious awareness of living in the presence of God, that is at the beginning point of your preparation, the middle point, and the end point. I think there's the danger of treating it linearly, like I'm going to do a kind of prayer spiritual exercise here, now I'm done with that, now I'm going to start doing my hard work here. And I think it's all of that is encompassed within the labor of prayer. One of my own theological heroes, Karl Barth, said that the theological task, which is the same as preparing a Sunday school lesson, the theological task is prayer and labor. That's what it is. And it's not prayer that then leads into labor, but it's labor as in its entirety understood as an act of prayer.
Sure.
Now, that's me giving you a theoretical answer. How that works itself in my own life is a daily battle. But that's.
Well, it's like any conversation. There's a give and there's a take. You're offering your prayers to the Lord for your preparation, but then you're also receiving, from the Lord, and both in quiet prayer, but also in the interaction with the text, and you're typing it out.
Yeah.
For me, I've begun to pray for the people that I'm going to teach or going to preach to, and I feel like that's made a big difference. And just really, that's as I think through the audience, like we were talking about, just really praying for them, and I feel like that's been a real help. And so, what about the Spirit? And as you are teaching, what role does the Spirit actually play in your presentation, not just in the preparation, but as you're giving sort of a freedom to move away from what you've prepared, or is that you find that sometimes I find that dangerous? Like, I'll start going off on a rabbit trail, and that I haven't thought through too well. So, what do you think about that?
And this has been a transition over time, and also an area for me where I can see the difference in my freedom in one area, say preaching, over against my freedom in another area, teaching. And again, part of that is repetition and doing it more. I've got a friend who speaks honestly into my life. I'm very grateful for this. And he has told me on numerous occasions that when I preach, I'm so wed to my manuscript that it seems kind of, stilted. He's like, I've heard you preach, and you're not the same guy that I hear teach. So I think that's an area that I'm still thinking through, even in the relationship of the manuscript. Some people do manuscripts real well. I know there's a preacher that I listened to a lot in my 20s. I'm very moved by his preaching style and format, and I came to find out that he's a manuscript preacher. I was kind of stunned by that because it didn't sound that way at all. So this is not so much a notes versus a non-notes thing, but for me, with my teaching here at Advent, I've really moved. And again, this is just me, so I can't be imposed on other people. But for me, I try to do a lot of work thinking, getting thoughts and ideas out, I'll give myself an outline from which to work, maybe some block quotes here or there, and then I'll just let it go. And I have found that can be both nerve-wracking and freeing at the same time. I mean, if I had to do that in a preaching context, I'm not sure I'm free enough to do that yet. That's maybe my own insecurity at work. But as far as in a teaching context, I've found now, you've given some time to this, you've worked through this for a while, here's where you want to go, and now let's just go in there and let the teaching moment itself be an experience. See, that's, when you're talking about the Spirit, that's the part where I can't anticipate that. And that's both the fun part and the unnerving part, because you get in there and it just takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And you walk away and you go, I wasn't planning on that. And there can be the downside too. I mean, I taught yesterday on something here, and I walked away from a few points thinking, Ginolette, you did not, you should not have done that. But that's,
Yeah.
I do think as well. I mean, this sits on the issue that you're tapping into. A writing life has a certain necessity attached to precision. Whereas, and I hope people know this, but maybe they don't, I actually allow for a little bit more hyperbole and expansion of expression, I would say, I guess, in a teaching moment. Because again, I think it's a different kind of thing. That's a real encounter between people. And I allow the enthusiasm attached to that to build on itself. Yeah.
So, Mark, one of the things that you talked about was growing as a teacher with experience. So what would you say to someone who doesn't teach very often, at least not in this context? Maybe they do some presentations for their job or something. Maybe they're just naturally gifted or have a proclivity towards that, but they don't do it a lot. I mean, how do you, what thoughts do you have for someone to sort of improve themselves as a teacher who doesn't get that much opportunity?
Yeah. That's a good question, and it's one that I'll probably continue to give more thought to. I remember one time playing golf with a guy. I'm not a good golfer, and we were playing golf, and he was really good. And I kept asking him, how do you do that? And he told me, he said, I don't know. I can't.
Yeah.
And I think even for me. Coming out of your graduate studies, your postgraduate studies, and then going into teaching, which is so crucial for what I do for a living, it's how I pay my bills.
Sure.
No one helps you with that. Isn't that crazy? I mean, no one helps people who are coming out of research and writing an academic dissertation that if it gets published, probably just you, your mom, and maybe 3 other people might look at it. So it's that kind of writing. To then speaking to a group of students who aren't specialists and go do that and be good at it. I mean, there's just not a lot of help on that. So I guess my advice would be to people who are trying to think about being good teachers and wanting to better themselves, which is the right thing. I mean, I try to think about that a lot. And number one, I guess it would be to be teachable. I think about, I can find myself even falling into certain patterns as a teacher. And if criticism comes from a student or from another source, finding myself kind of resistant to that because this is what I do, rather than saying, I need to be open and teachable to betterment. This was the second thing would be, I think, to observe or to think about teachers who've had a big impact on you in your past. I mean, I have a Rolodex in my mind of certain professors that were learned in their subject matter, communicated it effectively, and engendered a passion for the subject matter. And I can see these profs or Sunday school teachers or whoever, and they are with me to this day. So I would say, I asked one of my seminary professors one time, how do I become a better writer? And his answer was not, here's 3 books on writing technique. It was, read good writers.
Yeah.
So I would say for people who are trying to think about being better teachers, maybe a good way at that is to start watching or listening with the availability that we have now, with the internet and with iTunes U. I mean, just to listen to what we consider to be good teachers, and that's been big for me. Just to think about what it means to be a good teacher. As far as like 1, 2, 3, I mean, I guess a big issue would be thinking about being clear with what I'm trying to achieve in this 30 to 45 minute period. What are my major points? Are those clearly identified? And then what's the big thing I want people to walk away with?
Right.
But as I say that, I know that I might get that target 50% of the time. Because it's a moment, and you got to follow the moment itself. But I think clarity and brevity are very important attributes of good teachers. But it's a good question. I mean, I think I'm continually to wrestle with it myself, and I imagine that people who teach here will too.
One of the things I try to tell my Christian Ed staff is that our own personal devotion fuels our ministry, and whether that's true, whether you're in accounting here at the church or whether you're in youth ministry or whatever it is. And I would just add to that from a technical standpoint, just your own personal devotional life is critically important to just not only fueling topics as a teacher, but also fueling your passion and your depth and your really ability to hear the Spirit. Would you agree with that?
That's a great point. And the way in which your personal devotion, I like how you framed that. The way your personal devotion also, and your following of Jesus, how that shapes and frames the way in which you view everything. That's so crucial. I've said this in other contexts, so I'm sorry I'm repeating it here for people who've heard me say this before, but Brevard Childs, who's a hero of mine and a very clear writer, I've never heard him teach. Childs was asked, how do I become a better reader of the Bible? And his answer was, become a deeper person. And that's haunted me, because I think, by and large, we tend to think about technical skills that one can develop and hone, which, by the way, in the Reformation tradition, they would have 2 thumbs up on technical skills. Learn your Greek and your, whatever you can do it. But the Reformers would never have said that your technical skills alone can make the Bible happen.
Right.
And so this is where that becoming a deeper person, or the gravitas of someone, lends to their teaching. We've had this. I know I've had this experience too, where someone's teaching and they're saying something, but you realize there's a lot underneath the surface of what this person is saying, and that's I think the gravitas of becoming a deeper person. Whether that's reading fiction or poetry, or it's a broad array of things.
I think there's a huge difference between a teacher who's giving you everything they have and everything they know, versus the one who's just dipping into the well and bringing it up, and there's a lot else down there. So, let me ask you this, I feel like you hear the spirit in which I ask it. How do you know when you've taught a good class? You're a good teacher. I mean, but you're a gifted teacher, and where there's a gift, there's a giver. I mean, we look to him and give him the glory. But how do you know when you've taught a good class, or do you?
I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how. Of course, there's the old joke about was it John Bunyan that was coming down from the pulpit?
That's an old joke. Yeah,
yeah, it's an old joke.
Yeah, it must be.
About the lady who tells him that was the best sermon I ever heard.
Spurgeon. I think.
Oh, was that Spurgeon who said that?
Yeah.
Oh, I love the story. And the devil already told me that.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what to do with feedback. It really is. I find, how do I say it? I mean, candor, and I learned this from a teacher of mine, is one of the greatest gifts that anyone can give you, especially a friend. What's the proverb? Better the wounds of a friend than the kisses of an enemy. It means an enormous amount to me when people affirm a teaching moment. I mean, it's encouraging. You may know you made contact. You don't always get the critical feedback, which is really necessary to becoming better. And honestly, if you pushed me into a corner and said, do you want that? I mean, I would say, I know I need it. It's like, I know I need that. And so whenever someone gives you genuine critical feedback, that is a gift. So how do I know if I've taught a good class? I never, and I'm sure you maybe feel the same way, I rarely walk away feeling satisfied, like, you know, that was a home run. You know, I just don't, because I know, I'm thinking about what I did yesterday. I mean, I know yesterday I turned some phrases on my second and my third point that really, I'm not sure that's even true. You know, like I said a few things about this. I quoted an author and I said his name wrong. You know, I know all that, so all that kind of weighs on me. You know, and I'm not paralyzed by it because I don't think I'm a perfectionist in that way, but it's hard to know. So everything can be improved,
Right.
and that's how I think. So how do I know? I don't really. Yeah.
I feel like I try to gauge the energy of the classroom. You can kind of, it's palpable. You can feel it
Yeah.
as a teacher.
Yeah.
Do you feed off of the class?
No, that's another. Yeah. I think whether or not that constitutes something being good, I think is its own kind of question. But
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point.
But yes, now that I am aware of. I think in the teaching moment, I'm aware when a connection is being made, whether it's in a kind of silence in the spaces or whether it's in the attentiveness of people or the lack thereof. And that's the part really that probably as a teacher drives me nuts more than anything. I mean, if I'm looking at a class and I've got 25 students and 23 of them are in rapt attention, but I'm losing 2, I'm really concerned about that. Like I need to know. Like even yesterday, I could tell, you know, in the context, I was aware that a couple were checking out, and so I feel the not necessarily by just getting louder, you know, but I feel the necessity. I do read that. I try to read the audience, and so you know when a connection is being made, and you also maybe you probably never experienced. I know I do, where it's like this you know. I've got 20 more minutes and I can't wait till this is over. And I know they can't either,
Yeah,
right?
right.
They can't wait till this is
Yeah,
over.
yeah.
So those, you know, you can't always anticipate that. And that's I tell my classes at Beeson, that's the nature of the DNA of any class. You just can't anticipate it, and that's kind of fun.
Yeah. What just in sort of a wrapping up question, what would you encourage someone who aspires to teach, but is not a professional Christian educator, have another job or stay-at-home mom or whatever? What would you encourage them to do to prepare themselves to be ready when the call comes?
when Joe
Right.
leaves an email. How to prepare themselves? Well, I guess it trades on all the issues that we've probably talked about up until this point. But the fear of man brings a snare, right? I mean, that I think about that both in my life and in my teaching life. You know, the fear of failure. Man, while I was reading this, I guess it's sort of a known statistic, but the numbers of people's fear, like when it comes to what I fear the most in life. I mean, public speaking,
yeah, that's
ranks
right.
real high. Like I think it's right under Great White Shark. You know, I mean, it ranks real high. My father, who's an insightful guy, you know, I grew up in a tradition, in the Baptist tradition, where the pastor would just ad hoc call on people at the end of the church to pray. You know, my father grew up Methodist, and I can remember my dad going to the pastor and saying, "I just want you to know, I will fall over in the aisle dead if you call
Right.
on me. I'd rather hold a king cobra." I can hear him saying that by the head than do that. So, I mean, I realize, you know, people have to walk into their gifts, and that's, you know, so that's not everyone, and that's the beauty of the gifts of God to the church, that not everyone's called to do the same thing. The danger is that we can project our own gifts onto others, like, this is who I am, and I value that, and I think everyone else should be like that as well. That's you know, the toe and the foot and the hand. So all to say, to prepare themselves, I guess, would be just to give themselves wholly to the subject matter, to submit themselves to what it is, to prayerfully engage it, to aim toward a simplicity on the far side of complexity, which I struggle with. I mean, I still, is what I've offered simple and clear, not banal and facile, but simple and clear, that I've worked through the complexity of it on the far side now to present it in a clear way that brings I think, the gravitas of the complexity with it, but isn't weighted down by all the jargon and verbiage attached to it.
Sure.
So, all those things I think people can do to kind of prepare themselves, and that's an ongoing process.
Well, one last question.
Yeah.
And that is, from the pulpit, we make a very concerted point every week to preach the gospel. That is to articulate that Jesus Christ died for our sins. And yet, when we teach in our classes on Sunday morning, we find ourselves returning to that gospel message, not necessarily as proclamation as much as sort of the means by which we grow in Christ, a return to the gospel. What attention should a teacher give to how the gospel informs their content matter? You could probably write a book on that.
Yeah, in not just in some sense, but in a totalizing sense, the subject matter is the gospel, right? So the content of anything is the gospel. And so how one wrestles with how my particular text, remember we said at the beginning of our talk together, I can never divorce the words that are there from the subject matter of the Bible. And that's the hard work, I think, of biblical interpretation. That's the hard work. And that is a wrangling with how the gospel shapes our understanding of particular texts. Now, and this would be a fun, long conversation, but how particular theories of the gospel can become maybe overly heavy-handed in how we read particular texts. I mean, one has to wrestle with that, I think. And I don't want to betray the subject matter by giving an overly simplistic solution to that. Because I want to wrestle with that text, and I want to wrestle with what it's saying. But I need to wrestle with what it's saying in light of the whole, and that is a back and forward dialectic where I believe in that moment the combustive work of the Holy Spirit takes place. So it informs everything. Yeah.
Great.
I mean, if you leave people at the end of any lesson with a charge to pull themselves up by their moral bootstraps and actualize themselves in some moment of self-sufficiency, then something's gone really wrong.
I hear you. That's right. That's right. Well, Dr. Mark Gillette, thank you very much for your time.
Fun.
It's been really helpful for me, and
Me too.
And I hope it's a blessing to many people.
Thank you.
God bless you.